ABIM pass rates just hit their lowest point in at least 5 years, and they're still dropping. In 2025, 1 in 7 first-time takers failed. That's over 1,500 physicians who finished residency, studied for the exam, and didn't pass. For endocrinology, it's 1 in 5. For nephrology, it's 1 in 6. Everyone blames COVID, but I looked at the burnout data, the USMLE pass rates, and what I'm seeing in my own coaching, and the numbers don't add up. Plus, the exam hasn't changed, so something else did. Today I'm going to show you what the data actually says, why the most common explanation falls apart, and 3 things you can do right now to make sure you're not one of the 1 in 7 who fails. Let me walk you through the numbers coming from the ABIM's own published data. The internal medicine pass rate was 88% in 2021, and it's been dropping every year since. The next 3 years it was 87%, and then this past year it was 86%. This 2025 exam cohort is the lowest in the ABIM's current published data. Now, before 2021, pass rates were in the low 90s. Some years it went as high as 93%. So we've gone from roughly a 7% failure rate to a 14% failure rate over the course of about 5 years. That's virtually a doubling. The thing that makes this even more shocking is that the number of people taking the exam is growing. In 2021, it was 9,500 takers, and in 2025, it was 10,700. So in absolute terms, the number of physicians failing has grown at an even faster rate than the failure rate itself. Over 1,500 doctors failed in 2025 alone. Note that it isn't just internal medicine that's being hit. Subspecialties are getting it as well. In endocrinology, the pass rate was 79%. That's worse than 1 in 5 failing. Nephrology, 83%. Sleep medicine, 83%, and in cardiology was 86%. Cardiology is worth a closer look. A peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology tracked this trend specifically. They noted that the cardiology pass rates dropped from 96% in 2018 to 86% in 2021. That is a 10% drop, literally worse than a 3 times increase in the percentage of people that are failing. And that hasn't recovered. Now, in fairness, the ABIM does publish what they call an ultimate pass rate, which means eventually people who take the test pass it at a 98% rate. On the surface, that sounds reassuring. What they're saying is that almost everyone passes, nothing to see here, but that number hides a lot. In other words, if you fail, you're waiting an entire year to retake. You're paying for the exam again. You also may have credentialing issues with your employer. One of the most common reasons that people work with us for coaching is that they'll say, well, if I am no longer board eligible or if I fail on another time, then I may lose my job. Some of the subspecialists that we work with in things like critical care or geriatrics have told us that they will literally have to go back to fellowship if they don't pass in a certain period of time. Plus, everyone deals with the emotional toll of having to tell their colleagues or potentially not telling them that they didn't pass. So the rates are dropping, but the question is why? And the most common answer that you'll hear is probably wrong or at least incomplete. The most cited explanation for why the ABIM failure rates is increasing is COVID. And there's lots of published research that speculates that this is the reason. A peer-reviewed viewpoint in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology argues that COVID training disruptions are the main culprit. Now, on the surface, the timing matches. Training truly was disrupted. There were people who had a lot of on-the-job training that was completely disrupted by the COVID pandemic. And the trend is extremely broad. It shows up across many different subspecialties, not just internal medicine. An important point that the JACC authors note is that the exam itself hasn't changed. The ABIM did a major overhaul of the test in 2015, but since then has not made any major changes to the test. Plus, the exam is not graded on a curve, so the passing score is a fixed standard. It's not like they just decided all of a sudden that they were going to fail a bunch more people. In other words, if more people fail, it means that more people perform below a consistent benchmark. So, open and shut case, right? The COVID disrupted training, the timing matches, and the exam didn't change. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if COVID were the whole story, you'd expect the data to show something that it doesn't. There are 2 pieces of data that should make you question the COVID explanation. And as far as I can tell, nobody is connecting these dots. In addition to the fact that there was less on-the-job training, one of the most common reasons cited for how the COVID pandemic has affected people's ability to prepare for exams is the fact that burnout just completely skyrocketed. And the data bear this out. The AMA, the Mayo Clinic, and Stanford have been running a longitudinal burnout study published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings that's been tracking physician burnout since 2011. In 2020, 38% of physicians reported burnout symptoms. However, by 2021, when the pandemic was really starting to get in full swing, it was 63%. That is the largest single-year spike in the history of the study, and the effects were across the board. Emotional exhaustion scores went up by nearly 40%. Depersonalization scores went up by over 60%. Plus, primary care physicians were hit the hardest. Burnout rates reached nearly 58% in 2022. If you're struggling to pass the ABIM and you want to dramatically increase your chances of passing, be sure to sign up for our 14-step free program where we will teach you the principles that we use to help not just for the USMLEs, but also for physicians preparing for their specialty board exams. And if you want to accelerate your progress even faster in terms of implementing this system in your busy life, be sure to book a free call with our team where we can explain exactly what working with us would look like. So on the surface, this would be a really clear explanation for why the ABIM failure rate has gone up by so much, because again, primary care was hit the hardest. We see that the failure rate has nearly doubled over the last 10 years. However, something interesting happened. By 2023, the burnout was back down to 45%. This was roughly where it was in 2017. In other words, the burnout crisis, at least by this particular measure, had eased. However, the ABIM pass rates over that exact same period have still been dropping. If it were a burnout phenomenon stemming from COVID, you would expect that the ABIM pass rates would have gone up after burnout and training has improved. However, that is not true. Burnout spiked, came back down, but the pass rates have dropped and haven't come back. So if it's not burnout, maybe it's the fact that there was just less on-the-job training. But here's the other piece. The same cross-section of trainees that are failing the ABIM at a 14% pass rate are passing the USMLE Step 2 CK at a 97 to 98% pass rate. Let that sink in for a second. Step 2 CK, which just like the ABIM tests clinical knowledge, has been seeing steady or even improving pass rates. The ABIM, which also tests clinical knowledge, which presumably would have been hurt by the lack of on-the-job training and would have improved as on-the-job training had returned, is still declining. Now, obviously there's important differences. Step 2 is taken during or right after medical school when oftentimes you're given a full-time study mode. The ABIM is taken right after residency or while you're working as a full-time physician. But that's exactly the point. In addition, obviously Step 2 is taken on a greater importance in the era of Step 1 being pass-fail. So who knows, maybe Step 2 rates would be a lot lower had it not taken on so much more importance. However, it would be hard to argue that it was only the lack of on-the-job training that came from the COVID disruption, because A, on-the-job training has increased since then, and B, another exam in which on-the-job training presumably would have been impacted has seen little to no impact in terms of the pass rates from the lack of on-the-job training. So if the exam hasn't changed, burnout has recovered, and these doctors clearly knew the medicine at some point, what's going on? Nobody has the definitive answer. But I coach physicians preparing for the ABIM, and what I see over and over again is not necessarily a knowledge problem. In reality, it's actually closer to a preparation strategy problem. One of the most common things that we see is that MKSAP scores are not necessarily reflecting what it is that people are studying. Instead, their scores are reflecting how much they can remember and apply on test day. And for most physicians, those are two very different things. Now, I'm not claiming to know what it is that is causing this large increase in the number of people failing the ABIM and other subspecialty exams. However, what I can say is that regardless of what's causing the decline, there are principles at work to increase your chances of passing the ABIM, regardless of how much time you have every day to study. Now, let me be clear, I'm not going to give you a full study plan here. There's a separate video that I'll link to at the end. However, what I want you to walk away with today are 3 things that you can start doing immediately that will maximize your chances of passing the ABIM on your next attempt. The first principle is to test yourself in the way that the exam tests you. Now, we all know that the ABIM gives you a clinical vignette and asks you to make oftentimes a decision about management or what's the diagnosis or things like that. Now, that's not the same as recognizing information when you see it in a review book. However, if you look at the way that most people prepare, they do it by reading, right? The issue is that reading is recognition and the exam is testing something different. They're asking, can you use it under pressure in a time scenario with distracting clinical details? I'll give you an example from a student that I worked with recently. They were studying hyponatremia and they learned a ton about hyponatremia from MKSAP, from the board basics section. And they could recite a lot of facts. However, they got a question wrong because in the vignette, they had seen labs that were about serum sodium and urine sodium and FeNO and something else like that. And they really struggled because they hadn't practiced reading the actual sodium labs. And so even though they could recall and recite all of the different pathways and understand what is hyponatremia, they were struggling in that particular skill. And so the principle here is that you want to take the thing that you're struggling with and then reverse engineer all of the things that you would need to know and be able to do so that you could do that thing, right? So in this case, analyzing the labs for sodium, urine and serum sodium, and be able to actually apply it in a time setting. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 is that you want to build a system that prevents forgetting. Now, one of the biggest challenges that people that we coach that are studying for the ABIM or other specialty boards is that you just don't have a lot of time. When you're studying for step 1 or you're studying for step 2, you have full-time study. And so oftentimes what we see is that people may not have had the best system for remembering things. They may not have had the best system for studying in the first place, but they made up for it because they were able to just outwork other people. They were able to, despite the fact of not being particularly efficient, if you just study a lot more hours, they were able to actually, still pass the test. Maybe not by a huge margin, but able to do it. Now, the issue is that when you don't have the ability to spend huge amounts of hours, like you're working a full-time job as an attending, or you're in fellowship, or something else, then now your system and how efficient it is becomes super important. And one of the best ways of improving the efficiency of your system is to have a system for preventing forgetting things. Now, if you want to learn more about this, be sure to hit like and subscribe and hit the notification bell because we talk a lot about systems for retention. However, what I'll say here is I highly recommend that you use Anki. Now, Anki is a spaced repetition tool to make sure that when you learn something, you never forget it. It works great, especially when you don't have a lot of time every day to study. For example, I've been doing this for about 17 years, and it takes me about 20 minutes to remember more than 28,000 flashcards worth of material that I've made since my first year of medical school at Stanford. And I know everyone worries like, oh, I haven't done this for 17 years, so I can't do it. That's not true. You can literally start with just 1 flashcard a day or 2 flashcards a day, whatever it is that you have the time to do. Just make sure that you do it consistently, and you'll find that your knowledge will accumulate over time to the point where whatever it is that you've learned, you just won't forget it, and it makes a dramatic difference in your ability to pass these tests. The final principle is to go deep before you go wide. The instinct that kicks in when you're scared about boards is to try to cover everything. We see this a lot where they're like, I gotta cover all of MKSAP. I need to hit every single subspecialty, especially the stuff that I haven't studied in a really long time, and they cast the widest net possible. The issue is that when people feel like they have to cover everything, they will only give themselves the time to cover it at a very, very surface level. This gives them very little depth, and one of the most common reasons that people will miss questions from a knowledge standpoint, in addition to just forgetting it, right, and not having a system for retaining it, is that they didn't have enough depth of understanding in the first place. We see a lot of people who have this vague understanding, or they've heard that, or they remember reading that, but they don't have the reliable knowledge necessary in order to get the questions correct in a high stakes timed environment. What I would recommend instead is to pick one subtopic at a time and go through that and get it to at least 80% before you move on. Personally, I like starting with coronary artery disease, especially for the ABIM, because cardiovascular disease is literally 14% of the ABIM's blueprint. Once you've mastered that and you can get it to 80% on 10 consecutive questions, then you know that your studying is working. And as long as you made some flashcards to make sure that you don't forget it, you can just continue to stack subtopics where you'll just learn and retain more and more over time. That way, when you're really busy, you just learn maybe a half subtopic that day, or maybe even a quarter. And when you've got more time, like a weekend or some time off, you can study more, right? You can scale it up or down. And because you have a system of retaining that information, everything that you're learning, you're adding to your bank, and you're not gonna have to go back and relearn it later. In addition, and this is probably one of the most important things, is that we see a lot of attendings get really down on themselves when they've studied for a while, like they've been studying for, years, and they get like a 40% on one of their MKSAP blocks. And they're like, oh my God, this feels horrible. And of course, they're not gonna feel super motivated to study. And so then it becomes this vicious cycle where they get a low score, and then that low score makes them feel really awful. And then now they're not motivated, they're not, excited to make time to study. And then because they're not making time to study, their scores continue to not get better, and then they feel even less motivated, and the vicious cycle continues. Instead, when you're getting 80% on the things that you're studying, people's motivation changes, right? Their belief in themselves starts to change. They stop telling themselves, oh my gosh, I'm a bad test taker, and they start to believe, oh yeah, no, I can actually do this. Because our belief, our anxiety levels, our motivation are all products of our experience. And if we are studying and having positive experiences when we study, then of course we're gonna have more belief in ourselves and not think, I'm a bad test taker. ABIM pass rates are declining, and the usual explanations don't fully account for it. Something about how we prepare for boards after residency is broken. And until that changes, I don't think that these rates are gonna go back up. In our experience, the fix isn't complicated. I made a video called ABIM Boards, Why Smart Doctors Still Fail and How to Fix It. It walks through the 10 steps I use with every physician that I coach. If you're preparing for the boards, that's the place to start. Remember, you're not a bad doctor. You just need the right approach.